Plants have been elevated to this place of holiness in our society. Everyone thinks they're so benign. It's this magical kingdom of plants just put here to make life marvelous for us. Plants were invented before we were, and they've had to duke it out in the roughness of nature. But nowadays we have this Disneyland version of nature. It's like all sweetness and songbirds everywhere. And it's not how it works.
So welcome back to another episode of L Podcast. Today's guest is Sally Norton. Sally has a nutrition degree from Cornell University and has a master's degree in public health. In her career, she has worked in medical education, public health research, holistic healing, and is the author of the recent book, Toxic Superfoods: How Oxalate Overload is Making You Sick and How to Get Better. Thank you, Sally Norton, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
So what are oxalates?
Oxalates is a family of chemicals that come from oxalic acid, which is naturally made. Nature makes it, and it's toxic. So it's a simple toxin that's plants tend to make a lot of it, and many of the plants that we eat and trust are high enough in oxalic acid and the related oxalate compounds that they're trouble.
How did you even get interested in this hard word to pronounce, oxalates? How did you get interested in this? What was your journey down this road to study this compound that probably very few people have ever heard of?
Yeah, we haven't heard of it. In college, it was just 2 little paragraphs in textbook, like 1 inch in the textbook. We use this diet for kidney stone patients, and you shouldn't eat a lot of oxalates or tannins with your dinner because it chelates calcium and lowers your mineral absorption. So don't have your tea with dinner. End of discussion. I never suspected that oxalate is what I've now come to realize can cause all kinds of challenges that I was suffering from since the time I was probably a little child, and certainly started coming on. And when I was 12, I started having arthritic pains, back problems, which continued and persisted, and I had bad elbow in college. I could barely pass tennis class because I really couldn't handle the tennis racket. I had all this stupid stuff, exhaustion, troubles focusing. And it got worse. I had to drop out of Cornell for foot surgery, and I really had foot problems badly in my 20s, where I was relying on crutches a lot of the time. I needed wheelchairs to go into the grocery store or the mall. I was on painkillers. I left for foot surgery, didn't recover well, and I continued to have some degree of foot problems for 30 more years. And goes on and on and on. I ended up having to really stop my career completely. I'm now disabled, needing a total hysterectomy. My brain isn't sleeping. 29 times an hour, the brain's waking up, which is why I can't function. I can barely read, can't exercise anymore. The literature suggests that it's dysbiosis coming from overgrowth, like a SIBO, a small intestinal bacteria, too many bacteria producing toxins that wreck your brain so you can't sleep. So there's some toxicity thing going on in me, and I'm trying to fix it. And I'm circle back around and come to this thing where this woman in North Carolina has this nonprofit agency teaching people to avoid high oxalate foods in order to handle pelvic pain. And she named her organization after vulvar pain. It's a vulvar pain foundation, and she'd been working with women and men with all sorts of pelvic problems and found that there was a sort of connective tissue disorder that they tended to share. Things like fibromyalgia and these aches and pains and things like I had had for decades clear up when they try to address their vulvar pain by getting rid of foods high in oxalic acid, which is, well, hey, that sort of fits me, but it doesn't fit my background. No, that's a kidney stone diet. And how the heck does that have anything to do with, besides, I have this sleep problem. I got to solve that instead. So I really didn't see the relevance of it. But I finally, through my own experimentation of trying to fix the sleep problem, I started using kiwi, which is a high oxalate food that has oxalic acid and it has these calcium oxalate crystals in it. Plants build calcium oxalate crystals for many reasons. One of them is self-defense. The self-defense crystals are pointed arrows, like toothpicks, double pointed on each end, very sharp, essentially like little shards of glass. They're hard like quartz, harder than your teeth. Literally chewing on them can wear down your tooth enamel. And eating them, they're so sharp they can puncture 2 cells deep and cause kinds of damage and inflammation and problems. If nothing else, it should be rational that eating bits of glass is not good for your gut. I was doing this kiwi thing to deal with the constipation, to deal with what I thought was maybe a SIBO problem that might have been the reason why I couldn't sleep. And by adding back those high oxalate kiwi fruit to my diet, my arthritis came back. And I'm laying there, I'm getting stiffer and stiffer over the course of about 3 months of this experiment. And I'm laying in bed one night realizing all that arthritis I had in my 20s when I was the perfect organic vegetarian and then a vegan later was related to oxalate in the foods that I was trusting to be healthy for me. I was, wow. And so I'm like kind of frustrated that I have to do this stupid oxalate thing for my arthritis when I'm trying to fix my sleep problem. So I started doing it with a bit of a chip on my shoulder. Like, I really didn't want to have to do this. I was too sick to be bothered with yet another problem with another different solution. I thought all my issues were separate things. But I do this thing properly, and within 10 days, I'm reading better, my mood is brighter, my brain is working better, and it's clear that I'm sleeping better. I really didn't know that I was sleeping so badly because I was so exhausted that I couldn't tell I wasn't sleeping. I'm just kind of out of it all the time. And I started to perk up and be able to read again. And that was stunning to me. And my feet problems after 30 years, now my feet are much happier. I can go barefoot for the first time in my adult life without the support of shoes. I can now run barefoot on pavement. I could wear heels. I was suddenly wearing heels for hours at a time. I could never have done that in the past because I quit eating Swiss chard, sweet potatoes, and kiwi. That was a tragic revelation that I myself had been the reason my choices of healthy food were the reasons so many horrible things had been happening in my life.
You start your book out, Toxic Superfoods, where you talk about the actor Chris Hemsworth, who's the actor that
Liam, actually.
Or is it
poor Liam,
right?
Overlooked brother. Chris gets all the attention.
Right, it's the overlooked brother of Chris Hemsworth. And basically you said, pounding down like spinach smoothies, thinking it was healthy. And then he ended up having to go to the doctor because he had a kidney stone. And then Austin, I mean, you mentioned this in your book, but it reminded me of when Austin Kutcher was preparing for the role of Steve Jobs for the movie, I think it was called Jobs. He ended up having to check himself into a hospital because he was trying to emulate Steve Jobs' diet, which was that fruitarian diet, and he ended up having issues with his pancreas. And of course, Steve Jobs died of pancreatic cancer, and I think even later on he contributed it to the fact that he was a fruitarian for decades. Why is it that everyone thinks that fruits and vegetables are so healthy? And like you mentioned before, fruits and vegetables, they can't move. So their defense mechanism is having toxins. Like you could have a magic mushroom, maybe the toxins are psychedelic, or you could have something else like you're talking about spinach or chard, where then you're talking about these oxalates.
Yeah. Plants have been elevated to this place of holiness in our society now. Like everyone thinks they're so benign. It's this magical kingdom of plants just put here to make life marvelous for us. Plants were invented before we were, and they've had to duke it out in the roughness of nature. But nowadays we have this Disneyland version of nature. It's like all sweetness and songbirds everywhere. And it's not how it works, unfortunately. And even the basic food web or the food chain, people miss the point. Like everything eats something else to survive. And there's this apex predator up there who eats the meat, who ate the other meat, who ate some plant, who ate some algae, who ate some bacteria, who ate some funguses. And the funguses will bring you back around and the whole loop recontinues. So the energy of things cycling through the ecosystem involves things eating each other. So anyone who's going to get eaten needs a self-defense system. And plants produce all kinds of chemicals, and they're not always just against predation, but we're talking here about predation from funguses, bacteria, insects, all kinds of bugs, and so on. And oxalates happen to be a very helpful compound to plants that allow them to store calcium and protect themselves in many ways, and even capture sunlight better, and even use it as a carbon source for when there isn't sunlight around, or they can't do photosynthesis at certain times and so on. There's all kinds of ways it's helping their physiology, including putting it in their seeds as a way of saving calcium and making a nice hard shell, producing these calcium oxalate crystals. Remember, I told you they're harder than teeth. Well, that means if a tree loads up its bark with little blocks of calcium oxalate crystals, it makes it really hard for the insects to bore holes into the trees, right? It's perfect for the plants, and it keeps the bugs at bay. The bugs still survive and they still try, but everyone's working hard to scrape together dinner in a world where dinner doesn't want to be your dinner. So we're all working hard to eat wherever you are in the food chain, and everyone else is working hard to not be eaten. And that's certainly true for plants. And somehow we got into this Disneyland notion that really took on a life of its own in probably the late 1980s, when researchers started looking at these phytonutrients, they're now called, these phytotoxins, polyphenols, and all these plant compounds that are unique to plants that have nothing to do with our physiology whatsoever. And our body doesn't really want them. But back in the day, it was a sort of what I think of as a back of the envelope shortcut to say, these are antioxidants. And we were also looking carefully at aging, which we've been struggling with the war on cancer. And now we have autism, we have all this, the brain is struggling with old age. We're all getting demented, losing our minds too early in life. And so what is it about telomeres and all these theories about aging going on? And maybe these supposed antioxidants will save us from being old and dumb before our time. We got really excited about, they got to be antioxidants. But in fact, that's not how it works. But the concept sells supplements beautifully. It sells magazine covers. It sells theories. It sells the vegetarian message beautifully. So it's been leveraged for messaging that is more about ideology than it is about biology. But the thing is, the more you say something, the more true it is. It doesn't have to be true in the mindset of humanity. If you just say it enough, it's true. So we've really come to think that we need to eat a rainbow, and we've got to have fiber, and we've got to have phytonutrients. And the truth is, a lot of it is modern wishful thinking.
Sally, what are some of the worst foods when it comes, at least in terms of the highest content of oxalates?
The worst ones are the ones you're eating. And most of us our first worst one might be pureed sweet potatoes and beets as a baby. And then we get to have at some point peanuts and potatoes and potato products. And then we're eating whole wheat bread. And then there's chocolate. Your first birthday is like a chocolate cake. And then every holiday and kid thing, there's chocolate everywhere. So those are common ones. And you can get really into things like potatoes very quickly between the mashed potatoes for the healthy meal, and then the junk meals with all the fries and chips everywhere, and all the parties with the chips everywhere, and all the excuses to eat chips. And so you can really overdo potatoes, which is a common problem. But then you want to get healthy and justify your chocolate desserts and so on, and you're going to eat more spinach. And maybe you're crazy like me and you eat Swiss chard and beet greens, beets in all forms. There's the nuts, which have gotten really popular. The dietitian world has backed off on their fear of the fat in nuts. And now suddenly nut fat is healthy. They used to be like, oh, you can't eat nuts, they're too fatty, because we went into this really extreme idea about avoiding fat. And so everyone started buying these fat-free products all through the late 70s. And it got crazy in the 80s and 90s where there's a incredible fat phobia. So we weren't eating nuts. But all of a sudden now there's healthy fats. Oh, some fats are healthy. Nuts are the healthy fat. And then there's the ketogenicness of the nuts, that they're not high in sugar and carbs. So nuts are now everywhere. So you can go crazy eating way too many nuts. And that's very toxic to the gut and high in oxalate, especially the worst ones are almonds, cashews, and peanuts. And they're really common. Pine nuts aren't good. Many of the nuts are not good from an oxalate standpoint, but they also have other compounds in them that make them harsh. But we have this sort of benefits-only mindset. So we'll pick one aspect. Oh, it's green. Oh, it's low carb. Oh, it's this, it's that. And we'll elevate it without ever having a full conversation. It's kind of like, oh, he's really cute and his dad has money, so I'll marry him. Forget the fact that he's a drug addict and he got an F and he was passed through high school just to get him out of the door. Like, don't you want to look at the whole resume before you marry something? But we don't do that with food. We don't think carefully about what we're grabbing. So what are some other good examples of high oxalate foods? Some of the seeds are really high. Turmeric is high. Blackberries are high. Bran is high, the wheat bran, oat bran, and so on. Then there's these non-gluten grains, the sort of pseudo grains, quinoa, teff, amaranth, really high. The classic high oxalate food is rhubarb. That's how we originally discovered that eating too much oxalate will make you really sick, was through rhubarb. Back in the early 1800s was the beginning of a giant rhubarb fad in England. And the people who could afford rhubarb treats, because rhubarb requires sugar is expensive. Rich people had the time and money to have a lot of these rhubarb desserts, and they would force rhubarb in these greenhouses for Christmas time. So it was a really prized, special thing to have at holidays, because they had all that horse poop on the street. So you take the horse poop out to the greenhouse, it makes the greenhouse hot, and you can grow all this rhubarb. And it's a big thing. But what they found was that certain people would get very sick during rhubarb season, and that helped them to connect the oxalates to a whole syndrome that they called the oxalic acid diatheses, where people would get nutty and get very despondent and despairing and have this dark future and be a little neurotic, in addition to having some gut problem and aches and pains and complaints. And that's was pretty obvious. They were eating the rhubarb, you could eat rhubarb, and they get better.
Sally, we all heard the famous expression that the dose makes the poison. In your book, you said that tea is kind of a high oxalate food. I used to drink a lot of tea when I was younger. And then one day, anytime I would drink tea, I would throw up. And then I switched to coffee. But the dose makes the poison. Should people just avoid every one of these foods? Just cut it out completely? Or is there a threshold?
Right. So how to tackle this whole topic and how do you operationalize it in your life is a really important question. And tea is, by itself, a cup of tea is not a problem. In the context of the rest of the diet, maybe you had a seeded semi-whole grain bread with your tuna salad that you had with your cup of tea, and then you had a piece of chocolate afterwards, and that starts to add up. So what you want to do is kind of think about, there's multiple questions in what you ask. One is, how is it that now I'm sensitive to the tea and it's caused my body is rejecting tea? That is a great question, because we do see people, as they start to become aware of these foods, they realize their body had been sending them signals about that food. And how much of it is the oxalic acid versus how much of it is the oxalic acid combined with that food taught the gut. The gut is a learning system. We have sensory capacities throughout our body. It's not just your nose and tongue that's sensing what's going on with food. Your entire digestive tract and other cells of the body are sentient beings paying attention to what's going on. So there's probably a combination of things that definitely involves the oxalic acid. And unfortunately, people will think, well, tea is healthy. Everyone says tea is good. It shouldn't bother me. There's something wrong with me. And you start thinking, I'm just weird. Instead of, there's something in tea that's not good for me as a human being. And that's probably what's going on. But chances are, if you've got a reaction like that with food, you should respect that and listen to the body. And then look at the other high oxalate foods. Like for me, it was my sweet potatoes. Well, I got into the sweet potatoes heavily because I started realizing that I was reacting to bread and wheat, and I also was reacting to the beans. So I cut out the wheat and the beans, and I was looking for some starchy carb. And sweet potatoes were a delicious, fairly convenient way to get enough calories and carbs. And I was relying on them for breakfast, sometimes lunch and dinner. I would have them at least once a day, every day. And quickly after that, I started getting signs that I would have never put together with the sweet potato. So you don't connect it. But I was getting, right away, I got like crow's feet, wrinkles. I'm in my mid-30s and I'm getting crow's feet. I got this knots back behind my shoulder blades that would keep me up at night. It would be very difficult for me to try to fall asleep because at bedtime, it would just kill me, which makes complete sense because it takes a few hours after you eat the sweet potato or the high oxalate food before it's really heavily in your bloodstream and in your bladder and kidneys, where your kidneys filter this stuff out of your bloodstream and you pee it out in your bladder. So you could get symptoms anywhere in your nervous system, your gut, your circulatory system, or your kidneys and bladder 4, 5, 6 hours after you've eaten it. And so I would get these symptoms often at bedtime, which is really common. So the sweet potato is an example of, I didn't know to connect it, but once you learn that it's one of these high oxalate foods and it could be causing symptoms and you cut it out, you could get some more information about your own body and what it tolerates. But then you figure out which food you eat too much of. Is it too many nuts? too many potatoes, too much sweet potatoes. I was using Swiss chard once a week, and look at those big ones and then cut them back in portion size and frequency and try to phase them out of your diet. And then do this kind of gradually, because if it's really that you've been eating way more oxalate than you can handle, because we're designed to handle some of it, but it's a fairly small amount relative to that cup of tea. You technically should be able to handle 7 cups of tea as a total oxalate dose. You're not just eating tea. That's not the only thing that has the oxalate in it. So it's sort of low-ish how much we can tolerate. And the foods that are popular that are high oxalate, we're using more and more frequently now than we were before. So you take out and gradually take this down, because one of the biggest problems that is not recognized in science is that by eating this stuff so frequently, we are building up a debt of deposits in our tissues. Literally, we eat past what the kidneys can handle, and how much you can get out right after that, in that 4 or 5, 6 hour period after that meal, is limited. And it tends to stick in body tissues. And every time you eat it again, it holds it there, because the body will not clear them out until there's room in the bloodstream and room for the kidneys and the bladder to handle it. So when your system doesn't have a lot coming in, that's a signal for the body to release it, which I think historically we would have seasons where humans didn't eat nuts as a historical food. Nuts were left for the squirrels. It wasn't convenient and necessarily considered a standard. It was never an entree in human life until very, very recently. So you wouldn't eat those except for here and there. You wouldn't get greenery all winter long, and you just didn't always eat these foods year round. So you would get a break in the winter when you'd be more reliant on hunting and fishing out in nature, and you wouldn't have them year round. So in the wintertime, the body will be able to relieve you of the oxalates you build up during blackberry season and during potato season or whatever. So now we don't have that winter time. So you've built up your debt from your first pureed sweet potatoes, the first chocolate cake, those Reese's peanut butter cups, all that stuff that's been leaving little traces behind. Well, suddenly, after a couple of days without eating oxalates, the body's like, maybe this is a moment where we can unload these old Reese's cups. So get rid of the old oxalate. So we go into it slowly so the body doesn't get too excited about this sort of finally winter came. Finally, you're 40 and the winter is finally here. We can finally get rid of all this stuff. So you don't want to do that, because that's a sort of repoisoning. Because literally what's happening is you're poisoning your cells, the cells of your gut, the immune cells in your bloodstream, the cells of your liver, your heart, the vascular system. They're all being exposed to something that causes oxidative stress, membrane damage, mitochondrial damage, makes it hard for the cells to produce enough energy. They're struggling. They're in oxidative stress. They're doing all these aging things that we thought the phytonutrients were saving us from, but the phytonutrients come packaged with the very pro-aging chemical of oxalates and probably many others that cause metabolic distress. It's not just like some kind of healthy hormetic stress. No, this is like straight up eventual poisoning.
Oxalates are basically an anti-nutrient. How do they compare to other anti-nutrients, such as maybe like lectins, which I think everyone's probably familiar with?
Yeah, lectins are a ginormous protein molecule. Proteins are these big, long strings of amino acids that fold themselves up in once, twice, 3. They have 4 levels of folding to produce these massive beings that have these particular shapes. Lectins are a really crummy protein to be eating. You have to disarm them. And they come primarily in beans and fruit-like things. If you soak your beans for 3.5 days and pressure cook heat them, you completely disarm those proteins. You denature all their folding and so on, and they don't function anymore as a toxin. So lectins, at least you can prepare your foods for, which we used to do. In the day when humans didn't have modern technology and didn't have this speedy lifestyle, people knew how to handle grains and prepare plant foods to make them safer to eat. If you're going to eat acorns, you leave them in a woven bag or a basket in the river for 2 weeks and help get rid of the tannins. Tannins are another example of an anti-nutrient. It's a polyphenolic compound, a big molecule with lots of these little phenolic rings all over it. Tannins are very toxic. That's how they're called a tannin, because they're used to turn a nice soft skin of an animal into hard leather that can be a saddle or a gun holster, or shoes that can outlive you. Properly made leather and maintained leather lasts a long time thanks to tannins. The tannins change that protein. That's the other thing that the lectins are doing, is they're damaging proteins. They're attaching with little sugar molecules and messing up things seriously. But the body has enzymes for getting rid of the tannins and tries hard to not absorb them. Although now we're thinking of them as a polyphenol, as if they're good for us, and we're doing things, allowing some of these plant anti-nutrients to get into the body when the body's trying to not have them there. So we're adding black pepper to turmeric to force the absorption of curcumin, which the body may or may not want. We think we're smarter than the body. So plant anti-nutrients, there's lots of them there with the lectins, and you can prepare the foods properly. With the tannins, you can let your body defend itself and quit combining it with things to bypass the defenses. And with oxalates, there's not much you can do other than figure out where the oxalates are and try to lower your exposure to it. Now, if you have a leaky gut, you're going to absorb a lot more from the food into your bloodstream. So there's a certain percentage of it that doesn't get into your bloodstream that you just release in fecal matter if you have a healthy gut. But if your gut is problematic, then you can quadruple or more the amount of oxalate that can get into your bloodstream. So that's a big problem, because you don't even need a high oxalate diet to get in trouble if you have leaky gut. And if your kidneys are struggling and you're not cleaning the blood as well as you could, that's another reason why you can't handle the oxalates as well.
Yes, Sally, you mentioned about the hierarchy of the food chain earlier today. What is the hierarchy? Like, what is an ideal diet for humans?
We humans have really never done well acting like whales and trying to live on algae. We've lived around water a long time, so we are part of this sort of aquatic food chain, which is sort of a complicated place because lots of fish eat other fish, and you can bioaccumulate toxins in the aquatic system. So now we have to be really careful of, like, swordfish is high in mercury because it's so high in the food chain, and certain tunas can be high in mercury and so on. But we definitely, as an apex predator in the aquatic system, we throw a fishing line into the water and we pull out a fish and we cook that. We don't say, this is a lot of work. I'll just dive into the pond and get the seaweed at the bottom and have that for dinner instead. We haven't done that. We're at a different space on the food chain. We're not down there with the minnows and the tadpoles that are eating the seaweed, or the little algae that grow on a seaweed. So we're definitely, we're not herbivores. Out in the savanna and the terrestrial food chain, you've got herbivores who can live on high cellulose, fibrous things like the grasses. So the savanna has these grasses, there's all these herbivores like the buffalo and the elk and the cantaloupe, the antelope and, and the zebras and these guys. And they have this rumen, this four-part stomach that is really a fermentation vat. And really the animals aren't eating the cellulose. The bacteria are processing the cellulose, and the animal is eating bacteria. So even a rumen is eating a protein food to build. How do you build 1,000-pound animal on grass? Well, the grass becomes fuel for what the real food is, which is the bacteria. And people think why don't we just eat the plants? Well, we're not fermentation chambers. We don't have a giant cecum with a ginormous stomach. We have a fairly simple colon that is there to reserve water and so on, but it's not a fermentation chamber. And that is also, somehow we've lost track of that too, and we think we need to ferment fiber and we should have high fiber diets and all of that. But there's very limited evidence that fiber is even good for us, let alone that we should be promoting it as food for humans. We can eat a lot of things. We have this adaptability in all kinds of ways with our smart brains and adaptable physiology. We can't live completely on plants.
What percentage of the population is suffering from oxalate poisoning or toxicity, or just too much, whatever terminology we should use?
Yeah, it is a toxicity disorder. And given that our diets are so overloaded with oxalate, and that we see a lot of the related problems in the community of humans, it looks like oxalate is basically affecting the whole picture of what human health is. And aging, I think, is partially evidence that we're having too many of these anti-nutrients, especially oxalate. Many of the diseases of aging, arthritis, dementia, osteoporosis, loss of vitality, lower energy, loss of visual acuity, loss of hearing acuity, loss of your teeth. All of those things can be caused by oxalate problems. And we have never seen a subgroup of humans who don't eat oxalate seen as a comparison group against the rest of us who overdid the tea and the potatoes and the chocolate growing up. So it's hard to say for sure. I would love to be able to bring research minds on board and spend some real capital on asking those questions. Those are questions that no one seems to be interested in asking. In fact, those are the kind of questions that get dismissed out of the gate. Well, let's not bother to do the research to answer that question because that can't be so. Well, it certainly can be so. It probably is so. We don't have a good answer. But I think anybody who wants to live well, maintain their bone structure, keep their teeth, keep their vision, keep their energy up, avoid arthritis, avoid knee surgery, needs to be paying attention to the oxalates they're eating.
I know a lot of retired people. My parents are retired in Panama, and I go down there and visit them and talk to their friends. And they have a bunch of friends. They have like 100 friends down there. And it seems like as they age, as you get older, you're more concerned about longevity as you're staring it in the face, so to speak. But a lot of them, they reduce their meat content and then they start increasing their vegetable content. But as you're mentioning, a lot of the so-called, superfoods, like they increase their spinach and they increase a lot of these foods that are higher. They'll switch from coffee to tea because they think that's healthier. What advice would you have for someone that's looking to increase their longevity when they're retired?
Yeah, being older puts you in a sort of special needs category in a way these days, as being a young child or being sick in any way. These are populations from a public health perspective I am severely interested in protecting, like allowing those who are looking out for these groups, whether it's a nursing home situation. And the folks you're asking about aren't there yet, but I'm really concerned that we're missing the boat on this and that people are electing to use foods that I would forbid to be served in a nursing home, a hospital, childcare institution. You would not want to provide something that depletes the body of calcium, depletes the cells of energy, and causes oxidative stress. You wouldn't put that in the diet. So it's very unfortunate that the general conversation about how to be well is to eat more plants and vegetables and lots of spinach is great for you. This is a disaster, and you really will feel it if you're over 40 or 50 or getting into your 70s. You're really going to feel it, but you won't know that it's your food. You can't. For all these years, I was eating the sweet potatoes and doing these things to myself. I knew there was something with my diet that was part of this, but I never could connect it to the holy sweet potato or the fabulous Swiss chard or spinach. You wouldn't do it. So people need this information to be able to elect a better diet. And boy, are you right that older people, especially women, eat way too little meat. They're not getting enough protein. They need 100 grams of protein a day. When they're eating like 3 bites of meat and then a salad and then a chocolate dessert and then a cup of tea, that's not nutrition, and yet somehow in our heads it is. So how can we convince people who believe in spinach and their whole social circle thinks it's great? How could we convince them to go on an experiment like, well, let's cut the spinach and salads and do more roast beef and let's get a half a hog and do a nice kind of Central American festival where you roast a pig. Let's try that.
In your book, you mentioned about how people are basically focused on the macros, right? It's like, okay, what's the fat content of this food? What's the carbohydrate content? Or what's the protein content versus what oxalates are in there? What's the lectin content? Or are the vitamins fat soluble? Are they water soluble? And it's more just like vanity. Like they're not actually, like they want to say they're focused on health, but they're really more focused on how they're going to look. Looking at a bodybuilder, that has 4% body fat, that's not ideal. It's the whole obesity paradox. Elderly people that are 15, 20 pounds overweight live longer than people that are quote unquote normal weight. But people think the person that's quote unquote normal weight looks better, but they're not healthier.
There's several good points of what you're saying there. And I think it's really true that there's a certain vanity aspect to this at many levels. It's not just, is my gut protruding? Do I have a muffin top hanging out over my waist? Am I going to make this outfit look right? Am I going to look like a turd on the dance floor because I'm like sloppy? It's also, I'm eating the way the cool kids eat. Like I'm eating the cool food. I'm having the right salad, the rainbow plate, the organic this and so on. And there's a whole lot of fitting in going on with the mainstream narratives. It's really tough to go upstream and say, you know what? There's anti-nutrients in these things that we think are great that we're not paying attention to. So there's vanity in several levels. And you're right. Like sometimes you have to realize maybe 5 extra pounds of fat is not your biggest problem. Maybe that's not the first problem. In fact, a weight problem or a metabolic problem is a sign of some other health problem. It's not really so much the central problem. It's a symptom of the central problem, which we have yet to figure out what it is.
What do you think of some of these school districts? New York City is it like Vegan Monday? And you're seeing how these schools are basically, they have these kids that are captive and they're basically like telling them like, hey, no, like meat's bad for you. One, I feel like they're giving them really bad nutrition advice. And then two, they think this is healthy, but those kids are growing. This is a time where they need that protein and that fat.
And those minerals that are being lost to the vegetables that are high in these anti-nutrients. There's a lot of nutritional imbalances in that. Boy, if you wanted to chase away your teachers, just make your kids not have enough fat and protein all day, and they'll just misbehave and jump around the walls and have trouble focus and act out and be irritable, and they won't grow properly, and everybody will be in the 75 percentile. In fact, the top 10, the whole percentile moves down as our stature gets smaller and our expectations get constricted because we start normalizing brains that aren't working, bodies that aren't growing, deformities of all kinds. We say, oh, that's just otherness, rather than, wait a minute, something about our biology isn't expressing well. This is something going on biologically. No, we're just going to culturally absorb it. So it's really concerning that we're absorbing and institutionalizing ideas that affect people physiologically at such a critical time in life and affect your way of thinking to the point where you're not in a position to find what's not working because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So that can't be the thing that's not working. So you're frustratedly trying to improve your life, grow better, be able to dribble a ball enough to get on the team or some life ambition that you're not able to realize because you're missing out on key information. So it's tragic at every level. It's unfortunate that it's such a political football now, and the fighting about food is like fighting over religion.
Yeah, it is. You can't tell a vegan that they probably should add a little meat to their diet because some of the issues they have are caused by the lack of meat. They just aren't able to come to terms with that.
Not until they're so broken sometimes. They have to really get broken first. And unfortunately, some of that brokenness is not fully repairable, especially if it's happening in your developmental years.
Yeah, my fiance was a vegan for 17 years, and she quit being a vegan as soon as her hair started falling out. Even to this day, it's a very sensitive topic. Have you ever read the book Grain Brain? He calls dementia type 3 diabetes. Do you think that dementia could be type 3 diabetes? And he's blaming it on grain, but grain has a lot of oxalates in it. Do you think there's some connection between dementia and these oxalates? And then that's for the elderly. And then what about the younger people? You think maybe some of this autism is due to kids eating significantly more vegetables and less meat when they're young? Like you're talking about baby food as, who breastfeeds nowadays? Less people, then you're giving them pureed sweet potato or some other examples that you were talking about earlier.
No question that oxalate affects brain function, and so many other things cause brain inflammation. There's a neurotoxicity that's all about neuroinflammation, and it's anything that's turning on the immune system. Basically, all disease is cellular dysfunction, and all these things you're talking about are cellular dysfunction disorders. And the things that cause cellular dysfunction are toxins and lack of the right nutrients. So the combination of a poor diet and anti-nutrients and pro-inflammatory compounds is deadly for the nervous system. I have been floored by how many people come to me and say, my lifetime of anxiety is gone now that I've taken oxalates out of my diet. My depression, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm alive. I've been struggling since I was 8 years old to be the least bit really satisfied and happy and content and calm. And now I feel vibrant and excited about life and calm, and I feel like I'm alive. And people come to me almost in tears how they have struggled mentally and emotionally. And I've seen families with autistic children where the degree of autism abates tremendously. I mean, one young gal, she's 19, she's never been able to groom and shower alone. Her mother had to talk her through every step of the process of getting showered and dressed every day. until they went on a low oxalate diet. And now this kid is completely independent with her grooming routine and can do that all unsupervised. Can you imagine the liberation that is for that family? And this child is now well enough to go to day school, and she feels like she has her own life, and she goes off to this autistic school where she's in her 20s, and she feels like she's much more of a grown-up because her brain is happier on the low oxalate diet. So we definitely see a response to it. And there's some preliminary research that demonstrates a connection with oxalate and Parkinson's and other kinds of dementia disorders. And I do believe that a carbohydrate situation can cause dementia. My father had a vascular dementia, and I long blamed it on his cookie habit. He had a real sweet tooth from day one, but he also had an oxalate problem. I've realized recently that a lot of his problems with arthritis and tooth pain and his neck going out and various things he struggled with were oxalate as well. He grew up on Swiss chard and beet greens and these kinds of things. He taught me to put vinegar on the greens and love them. He always loved his greens. And the more he improved his diet, where he would get away from the butter and use olive oil on his toast and eat salads at lunch and so on, the more his root canal needed to be done and his this and that, and his arthritis got worse. So I feel like my own dad had the combination of the sort of type 3 diabetes and the oxalate poisoning, which is what took him out at a fairly young age with a hemorrhagic stroke at 78 years old.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry to hear that, Sally. You talked about some of these symptoms earlier, but let's just ask the question straight out. What should people really watch for? In your book, you talk about low energy, but I feel like that could be so many things. How do you know if low energy, say, is related to the oxalates or something else? What should some people look out for?
Yeah, so the testing's a little tricky. Like, you can't really take a blood test or a urine test. And the only gold standard test is a bone biopsy where they take bone out of your hip, but they're not going to do that for you. You can convince a doctor to do it, and it has also prone to what we call a false negative. So testing won't help you, and you do need to be aware of the symptom pattern. And I have in the book and on my website an inventory where you can look at how many of these foods you've been eating, what are the symptoms that you have that on the list, and do you have additional risk factors like having taken NSAIDs and all this kind of thing. But the original diagnosis in the 1840s was gut problems plus neurological issues, which could include migraines and headaches and mood changes. And that neurological means a lot of things. It can mean pain syndromes. It could be neuropathy. It could be poor coordination where your eye-hand coordination isn't good or your night vision isn't good, any kind of neurofunction. And when nerves are toxic, they're in a state called hyperexcitability, which turns the nerves on, which causes certain muscles to stay in a sort of spastic mode. And you can get fibromyalgia, you can get tremors and twitches, you can get hiccups. That's all neurotoxicity. You can get reflux because the sphincters don't, when the nerves are relaxed, the muscles relax. And when the sphincters relax, it's when it's tight. And when it's active, it's opening up. So if you have an active open sphincter, you're going to get reflux or maybe fecal incontinence or IBS or so on. I used to get these hiccups at nighttime. Not only did I have the muscle knot in the back, I would get bouts of belching and hiccups. And those are neurotoxicities causing muscle spasms. So muscle spasms are one. You also get memory problems. Then you have aches and pains that have to do with the joints and the tendons. You tend to bursitis and arthritis and swelling or gout attacks. Those are all inflammatory issues. Chronic infections. I used to get a sinus infection every single year, right around New Year's Eve day, sometime between Christmas and New Year's Eve. I would get a sinus infection every year from age 17 until I did this diet. I haven't had a sinus infection since. UTIs, nighttime urination is a big one. If you have to get up overnight to pee, something's irritating your bladder, and it's a good chance it's oxalate crystals forming in your urine as your kidneys are making urine. If you leak a little with your urination, if you have trouble with your urinary stream with men, you might have a little bit of prostate swelling. Those can all be signs. So you got the urinary tract, you've got your aches and pains, you got your nerve functioning, and you have your gut functioning. If you have something going on in at least two of those areas, you should be suspecting your potato habit or whatever it is in your high oxalate list that's on your menu.
So I have to ask, since the name of your book is called Toxic Superfoods, what is the most toxic superfood? For a while, it was IC berries were all the rage, and then quinoa. So what is the most toxic superfood? Or superfood, we should do that in air quotes, right?
Right, air quotes. Yeah, probably almonds are my favorite one to pick on because there's cyanide. There's so many other problems in there as well. It's so packed with nuts. The tree is not making a baby little tree seed for you. It's protecting the hell out of its baby with all kinds of things and does this whole set of toxicities in the nuts. And the almonds, if you're buying organic, they're laying on the dirty ground under a plastic tarp with no fungicide. And so the fungal stuff is growing all over it. And there's lots of room for other contamination in foods like nuts that just add to the lack of goodness. I mean, we think of it as so good and wonderful, and yet it's scary. So I think the gut is so important to protect, and the nuts and seeds and the anti-nutrients, all anti-nutrients basically harm the gut, whether it's saponins or whatever they are. All of them have gut damaging effects, and anything that's harming your gut is getting you in that critical place of the difference between the outside world and the inside world. Because the gut, the mouth, the lining of your mouth is still the outside world. That is a barrier function there that's protecting you and deciding how to protect you from problems. And if you ruin your digestive tract surface, you're going to affect your immune system, your nervous system, your overall health in ways that are quite regrettable, but avoidable. Meats and animal proteins, animal foods don't have those kinds of problems with the gut health. They don't have fiber and cyanide and phytates and oxalates and all these things in there that are damaging to the gut. And I think the nuts are the best at kicking you in the gut.
So Sally Norton, author of the book Toxic Superfoods, has joined us today. I just have two quick questions. Where can people find you, buy your book, get a hold of you, that kind of information? And then secondly, leave us with a final thought. And it doesn't have to be about the book, it can be, but what is Sally Norton's final thought?
Well, you can find my website, which is sallyknorton.com. If you go to some Sally Norton, it's a different website. So sallyknorton.com is the website. You can find my YouTube channel is Better with Sally K. Norton. That's another good place to check in. I have 2 Instagram accounts, SK Norton and Toxic Superfoods _Oxalate _book. So you can check in with me there. And the general thought is you really can do something about your health. Prevention has always been where my heart is, and it's better to prevent health problems, especially oxalate poisoning. You do not really want crystals in your thyroid gland, messing with your immune system, messing with your bones and bone marrow, making you old and decrepit before your time. If you want to be awesome, you want to be on the guard and not be all flower child and accepting notions of rainbow foods. Get real about nature and eat to protect yourself, grow, be healthy. You can do it. And this is easy. The Oxalate message, a few simple swaps can make a world of difference now and for a long time forward.
I like your quote, Sally Norton. Get real about nature.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.